Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. Today we're going to sort of back up a little bit, going back to the previous time period to look at the emergence of some of the key Enlightenment philosophers that are going to affect the developments in the modern period, 1750 to 1900. And I want to put those ideas in a context sort of first. The first thing I want to say about that is if you remember the presentation that I gave about why I argued that the Renaissance did in fact have a place in world historiography. And the main reason for that was because of the series of questions that are posed that culminate with the Renaissance that then open up space for all sorts of new questions. The question about the relationship between a person's individual faith and the authority of the church, which of course leads to the Protestant Reformation and in turn spreads Christianity around the world, we looked at in the last time period. So too the scientific revolution, where people start asking questions about what they are actually observing as opposed to what people tell them about the way the universe actually works. That has a direct impact on the Industrial Revolution, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks. But for right now, the key is the Enlightenment. Once the scientific revolution sets this precedent for the understanding of natural laws that eventually will lead to what we call physics, people start to ask, well, are there natural laws about the way humans live their lives in general? Not the natural world, but the human world. Are there natural laws to those? These in turn will lead to the answers to those questions will lead to some of the basic ideas informing the Atlantic revolutions. But there's another context that I want to remind you of as well, and that is the English Civil War. During the 17th century, you might recall, there was a huge power struggle between the monarchy on the one hand and the royalists who supported the power of the monarchy and Parliament, or the representative body on the other hand. And the English Civil War is this process of going back and forth over the course of many, many decades in the 17th century that will eventually culminate, though, in the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. Yes, there's still a king, immediately a king and a queen, William and Mary, but their powers are limited by a document, a kind of constitution. In that context, then, we start to see some of the earliest Enlightenment philosophers. Now, we're only going to focus in this presentation on the political ideas. That is to say, what is the best way to govern? What are the natural laws of human governance? The social and economic implications of those are ones we'll come back to later on. So, to begin, let's start talking about Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes was an Englishman who, during the English Civil War, was actually a royalist. He supported the notion that the monarch should have the control. Now, he wrote a book called The Leviathan that is the sort of the showcase of his basic idea. And I want to point something out. The Leviathan is this like mythical sea creature that is referenced to in the Old Testament. And the reason he picks this for the title of his book is he thought that the state should have this like huge, immense power. It should be this like overwhelming beast that controls everything. In other words, he believed that the monarch had absolute power. The state has absolute authority. Now, there's not a whole lot that's new about this, right? That, like, we've seen that before. This is just a variation on divine right of kings, is it not? Well, not exactly. Because while he still argues for the absolute authority of a monarch, the basis of that power is not in the divine right of kings, but according to him, the application of reason. It's logical that the state should have so much control. So he comes up with this term that there's an asterisk here because a lot of different philosophers are going to refer to this, but they don't all mean the same thing. but he coins the term social contract. Now, what does Hobbes mean by a social contract? Okay, well, let's back up a little bit. His basic premise is that man is selfish and aggressive. Human beings are by nature only going to do what is good for them. They don't care about anyone or anything else, according to Hobbes. Now, if that's the case, they're naturally inclined to warfare. They're going to fight, they're going to bicker, they're going to kill, they're going to steal, they're going to do whatever is in their best interest. Therefore, he says, man has to give up his authority to some absolute power who can then maintain the peace, if you will. So what I need you to understand about Hobbes then is he's a royalist. Like we think of the Enlightenment philosophers as being, for some sort of representational government or democratic in some way. He's neither of those things. What is new here, though, is he's saying it's only rational. It's logical. It has nothing to do with a divine right granted by God, but rather the social contract, as he understands it, is you have to give up a certain amount of your power to the state so that the state can manage to keep the peace. Otherwise, we'll just descend into anarchy because all anybody cares about is themselves. Again, not exactly what we think of by an Enlightenment philosopher, but nonetheless, his rooting his argument in the application of reason is what distinguishes him. Shortly after Hobbes, John Locke is born. Now, Locke is also alive during the English Civil War, but it's not exactly clear which side he takes. He starts off very much a royalist as a young man, and many of his positions seem to change over time, more and more starting to favor a more parliamentarian view. Now, his main text is called the Treatises on Government, the two treatises on government specifically. He has a very different idea of a social contract. He uses that term in this, the same term that Hobbes does, but he means something very, very different by it. Specifically, he says that humans are born with certain natural rights. This is a key idea that's going to be echoed from here on out. Natural rights. You're born with these certain rights, okay? For him, those natural rights are life, liberty, and property. Now, that might sound vaguely familiar because it is, with the exception of one term there. Instead of property, we know it as pursuit of happiness. We'll get to that later on. But that's his starting point, okay? That we are all born with these rights. If that's the case, what is the role of government? Well, according to Locke, government's job is to protect your natural rights. That's why government exists. It doesn't exist to keep the peace. It doesn't exist to keep everybody from harming other people. It exists to protect each individual's natural rights. Furthermore, if the government doesn't do that, according to Locke, then humans have an additional right to overthrow the government. He's not calling necessarily for some sort of revolution here, but he's saying that if the purpose of government is to protect our natural rights, which he claims it is, and the government doesn't do that, then you also have the right to overthrow that government and form a new one. Now, for him, that might involve getting rid of one monarch and replacing it with another one. This leads to an idea that we'll talk about more later on, enlightened despotism, that maybe you should still have a monarch with absolute authority, but he or she should rule by Enlightenment principles. Nonetheless, his understanding of the social contract, and particularly that notion of natural rights, is going to be crucial later on. Now, across the English Channel in France is a guy, Charles de Montesquieu. Montesquieu is a tough one to spell, but go ahead and learn it. In point of fact, he has dozens of names and titles, but his deal, he was a lawyer. He had studied the law in France during the time of the English Civil War, but he supported from the get-go the parliamentarians. He really thought that the notion of a constitutional monarchy was really an ideal form of government. He wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, again reflecting his background and training as a lawyer. But his main idea in that text is the notion of separation of powers. Okay, so here's the big thing. He is in this context of Louis, who calls himself the sun god, the like absolute monarch of absolute monarchs. But he wants to know, how do you avoid the abuse of power? What do you have to do in a form of government to ensure that you never have one person abusing the power? Well, his solution is to separate those powers according to the law. Specifically, what he says is you need to split out the powers of a absolute monarch, let's say. What does an absolute monarch do? Well, one thing he does is he makes the laws. That is the legislative power. But he also enforces the laws. That's the executive power. And then interprets existing laws that have occurred before him. That's the judicial branch. His idea is, instead of all three of those powers resting in one man, you have to separate them out into different people or groups of people. We tend to think of this in the terms that are put in our founding documents, checks and balances. That you need to separate out that power so that one aspect of the power has a way of counteracting any person or group of people who are trying to abuse the power in another branch. Another Frenchman shortly thereafter him, who's known to history by a single name, Voltaire, although he has many other titles and names himself. Voltaire, he might have been the most brilliant of all these Enlightenment philosophers. This guy, like by any measure, was pretty much a genius. He wrote poems, he wrote novels, he wrote plays, he wrote political tracts, but really, he was most popularly known because he was associated with the salons that were popular during in France during this time period. Now, a salon is not a place to get your hair did and your nails done. Uh, at the time, a salon was a word when people would invite other people into their homes. Frequently they would sit around drinking coffee. I'll talk much more about how coffee affects all of this later on at the end of the year. And they would debate ideas. Okay. Now, you got to remember, this is before, there's television or radio or movies or other forms of entertainment. In Paris, particularly, but France in general, this was a really popular pastime. Invite people in, you serve them maybe some coffee and some lunch, and you had debates. Well, he was like the rock star of the salon circuit. Like everybody who hosted a salon, which by the way was usually aristocratic women, they had to get Voltaire to come to their affair, to their salon. Like he was the most sought after guy. It's really very much like a kind of rock star. Like he's the guy that everybody has to see. So what's his deal? Well, his basic idea, he had a bunch of them, was toleration. All right. Specifically, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. He argued that all humans are these imperfect beings, and we should all be free to choose and believe what we want to choose to believe. I would point out too, freedom of religion. He also argued freedom from religion. He himself was an atheist. He did not believe in God at all, and he thought anybody that did was idiots. He thought religion was nothing but superstition. However, his whole argument was That's okay. You can believe in God if you want, but I have and you're free to worship and do whatever, but I am also free to tell you that I think you are absolutely wrong and that religion is a superstition. So again, the idea of tolerance there. I mentioned attacking prejudice and superstition in all its forms, even if it was not necessarily popular. He thought that that's what you were supposed to do. A big thing that he argues for then is the separation of church and state. Because the idea should be tolerance, religion in whatever form it might take should not have any role in the state, because to him the purpose of the state was to allow for the maximum expression of liberty through tolerance. And religion, by its nature, according to him, was inherently intolerant. Finally, then, we get to this rather complex individual, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, he's a pretty interesting case of the English philosophe, which is the French word, philosophe, which is the word for philosopher. But he sort of typifies several contradictory trends about them. He wrote a book called The Social Contract. Now, obviously, by referring to that title, he's making a reference back to Locke and to Hobbes ultimately. However, what he means by the social contract is very, very different. Behind this idea is something called the noble savage. Now, it's worth pointing out, he's writing this at a time when the French and British colonists are increasing their contact with Native Americans in North America. And in many ways, he sees Native Americans as the sort of like ideal person, the noble savage. Although he uses that word savage for a very particular reason. According to Rousseau, humans are born good. Their natural state is to be good. The problem is civilization. Civilization is what screws us up. It's all those rules and laws and customs that make things a mess for us. He rejected all monarchies, not just absolute monarchs, but constitutional monarchs, and instead promoted direct democracy. Now remember, representative democracy, or a republic, is when you vote for people to make decisions for you. Direct democracy means that citizens vote for direct action on every single issue. The only place that had seen it before then, really, in the context of Afro-Eurasia, was Athens during its golden age. But of course, that requires certain things. You need to have a relatively small society in order for that to work. And in fact, he advocated for that. It's almost a kind of like this anarchism. People should live in small groups, make their decisions directly, and live one with nature. There's some real problems with this, okay? So first of all, I want to remind you, what does that say then about the social contract? According to Rousseau, the social contract is you give up your individual will to the will of the group. So think about that for a moment. How does that contrast with Hobbes? Well, Hobbes says you give up your power as an individual to the state so that the state can maintain order. Rousseau is saying you give up your power as an individual, not to another individual, but to the will of the group. Direct democracy. So in other words, if we live in a direct democracy, we vote on every single issue that has to be decided. Well, if I vote no on something, but the majority vote yes, I have to give up my power as an individual to the will of the majority because the majority won. That's what he means by a social contract. Now, there's all sorts of hypocrisy involved in this. First of all, he was well known for taking money from aristocratic families and getting all of his travel paid for, but yet he hated the aristocracy and the monarchy as a theory. Secondly, he lives in France, a giant kingdom. How do you have direct democracy in a large society like that? But the biggest hypocrisy here is he was an overt misogynist, meaning he really thought women were inferior to men. And here he is going on about all of these things about, being at one with nature and we need to be free and all of this. He really only means men, though. He absolutely believes women are inferior to men. Finally, let's take a look at this image here, and I want you to notice something. Look at his hat and his scarf. They are both made out of feathers, okay? He had this penchant for using these stylish affectations. Is that a noble savage? No, but it's feathers. Like that's supposed to signify some sort of back to nature thing. But the truth is, the dude constantly was changing his public image, but always in ways that were like nothing but surface nods to some idea he had. Meanwhile, he's moving all over Europe to live with wealthy aristocrats who are, giving him money and food and clothing to hear him talk about, well, man, we need to just go back to nature and live around a campfire. But he's not doing any of that. So here's the deal. We have 5 philosophers from the Enlightenment, all of whom are in some way interested in this question of a social contract. What is the relationship between the individual and the power of the government? Yet they all have very different ideas about what is the ideal form of government. Nonetheless, they're going to raise the issues and their proposals to those issues, which are going to form the foundation for what will become the Atlantic revolutions, beginning with the American Revolution. So there's a focus questions to do using your notes, your annotated notes on these. And then tomorrow we will look at some of the documents and the ideas more closely associated with each of these 5 philosophers, and in addition, a couple of other things. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class.